Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the 2017 Resource Governance Index. I'm Liz McGrath, a senior researcher at NRGI, and I've been one of the many people to have worked on this data project. We're really excited to have an excellent program for you today. President Ernesto Zedillo, the former president of Mexico, will open with a keynote address, and this will be followed by a presentation of the index findings by President and CEO Danny Kaufmann. Sean Hinton from Open Societies Foundations will then chair a panel discussion which will include 4 additional speakers and take questions from the audience here, but also from those watching on our live web stream. We're really keen to engage not just those people in the room, but also our international webcast audience. So for those of you watching online, please use the hashtag Resource Governance Index on Twitter. I would now like to invite to the stage President Ernesto Zedillo. He was the president of Mexico from 1994 until 2000. As an advocate of multilateralism and inclusive globalization, Ernesto Zedillo is currently the director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization and chair of the NRGI Governing Board. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Liz. As she said, I am Ernesto Zedillo. I am chairman of the board of the Natural Resource Governance Index. My day job is to be a professor of economics and international politics at Yale University. And as she also mentioned, in my now distant youth, I served the Mexican government in various capacities. And for us at NRGI, today is a very special day because we come here to present to you and those that are following us in a webcast, we come to present what I would say is the flagship product of the hard work of many people, not only inside NRGI, our staff, but many researchers around the world that help us to put together this governance index. I think this is the second edition, isn't it, Danny, of the index? And I would say is an improved version of this governance index. But perhaps I should tell you a little bit the story of why we are here today. In the early years of the century, the Open Society Foundation decided to establish an organization which was called at the time Revenue Watch. The idea was to monitor, to promote the transparency and the accountability in those countries that use their natural resources to generate revenue, recognizing that there were, and unfortunately still are, very serious problems in these fundamental aspects. A few years later, a group of scholars decided that it would be of good use to think about something that eventually came to be called the Natural Resource Charter. The idea was very simple. The idea was to distill the best knowledge, the best research, the more illustrative experience of management of natural resources for the purposes of development. And putting together that best knowledge and experience into what we call at a time the Natural Resource Charter. Once this intellectual product was there, we thought that it would be valuable if we got organized as an international organization, non-profit, actually based in London, to promote the knowledge and the practice of that natural resource charter. After not such a long period, we realized that somehow there was a significant complementarity between what Revenue Watch was doing and what we were doing with the Natural Resource Charter. And we came to the decision that we will pursue much better the mission of the two organizations if we came together. And we agreed to put together the two organizations and to create with those two good institutions a new independent international organization. And that was the Natural Resource Governance Institute. About the same time, we were extremely lucky to attract Danny Kaufmann, who some of you already know, and the others will meet him now, as president of the new organization. And actually, Danny, who had a very distinguished career at the World Bank, and then had started to go to work for the Brookings Institution, had an immense experience in the measurement of something that not too long ago was not really measured, which was governance, the quality of governance. Danny was a pioneer, if not the pioneer, in thinking about the construction of governance index. So right after he came on board as president of our organization, he realized that given our intellectual framework, which was the charter, given the work in the field that we were doing as a consequence of the activities of Revenue Watch, we had a tremendous opportunity to construct a governance index on natural resources. The first edition of the index was published 3 or 4 years ago. We have continued to work. Danny and his team have continued to work to polish the methodology, to include more countries into our work. And today, we are very pleased that we will be presenting this second edition of the index. We think that it is timely, it is important for several reasons. First of all, I must invoke the mission of ENERGY. We exist to support countries' pursuit of their use of natural resources with the objective of development. We believe that natural resources must be used first and foremost to foster the economic and social development of countries. That's really what we are all about. And of course, in that endeavor, it is important to have a conceptual framework, but it's also very important to have the metrics of whatever specific governance means in the case of natural resources with the objective of development. And this is the idea of the index. We go through the methodology that will be explained here and try to measure whether countries are managing in the right way their natural resources, their oil, gas, and mining revenues from these activities. We try to do it objectively. We try to do it carefully. We have many years of experience because, as I said, Danny Kaufmann started this, which has become an industry, by the way, building indexes. But Danny started it all, and I think we have the best of that knowledge, of that experience, applied in the construction of this index. I said that it was important because we must be frank in acknowledging that despite some progress, there are still enormous challenges, not only in many countries, but I would say even in rich countries, advanced countries, challenges remain to consider that those resources are effectively and productively used towards the end of development. And in fact, we must be frank in admitting that in many cases still it is very hard to say, if not impossible, that the resources are being properly managed towards the objective of development. And if you push me a little bit in the argument, it is also true that in some very sad cases, it is strikingly evident that resources are terribly mismanaged and wasted. As we speak, we know the case of countries that were endowed by nature with huge oil riches, for example, that enjoy in recent years incredibly high prices of oil that potentially could have meant a unique opportunity in their history to foster their development, and we know that those resources were wasted in mismanagement, misspending, and corruption. And not only very little was left for the economic and human development of the people of that country or those countries, but that actually that particular country in my region I have right now in mind has now been impoverished, left with a terrible economic, financial, and political crisis. This is an extreme, but a very real and dramatic example of how the lack of good management can mean not only lost opportunities of development, but can also mean sliding down into a situation of economic, social, and political tragedy. And this is just one example of why we believe the work that we are presenting here today is important. This work, of course, is available to anybody interested on the subject. This work will be shown to governments. This work will be available certainly for civil society organizations that have as an objective the observation and the monitoring and the advocacy of having better government, better management, better development for countries. The work, of course, is available for the media, and we are hopeful that this instrument, which is one among several that our institute has, will serve the purpose of our mission. So let me express my gratitude to Danny and all the team that has worked very hard, all the researchers that have helped us in 81 countries where we have worked to build this index. And of course, I want to thank you for your presence here this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon here, good morning, and good evening everywhere else. I think it's going to be very important that I start with a couple of comments after Chairman Zedillo, our chair of the board of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, remarks, because I think there are a couple of things that were left unsaid, and you will understand why. Former President Zedillo is a humble person, and I feel uncomfortably focused quite a bit on myself, but let's mince no words. Not only we're so proud that he's our chairman, but essentially he single-handedly led a crucial country, one of the most important countries in Latin America, Mexico, on the path to democracy. And this is very important for us as a reminder where we are here today, because all the reversals that are taking place around the world in dozens of countries. And it will resonate even in terms of the work that we have done regarding open systems, open political systems, that they are closing civic space, and so on. The second clarifier that is really important, or extension, is that this is really what we're witnessing today, a collective work, where first and foremost, I owe an enormous debt to our staff, our colleagues throughout NRGI, and particularly the team led by Liz McGrath, who opened the discussion today, but as well as hundreds of researchers, as Ernesto mentioned, from throughout the world. I want to welcome everybody in the room here, and all of you watching live. And I want to also thank in these those partners, so-called sometimes donors that help us also with resources, but also with substance, particularly OSF, Hewlett, Omiyar, Gates Foundation, and UK's DFID, as well as the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation. So a few facts about the RGI. First, just to complement what President Zedillo said, we're talking here about the RGI, or the Resource Governance Index, which is essentially the assessment of the oil and gas, as well as the mining sectors in 81 resource-rich countries. It's the only international index focused on measuring that quality of governance in extractive resources, and it's a massive undertaking, as was said. There are a number of objectives here, aims. Some were mentioned already by President Zedillo, so I will only go through the not so obvious. The obvious is raising awareness and informed dialogue, but as important as that and the global policy advocacy to change global norms and improve, as important as that is the RGI as a tool for country engagement, for country reformists in governments, in parliaments, in civil society, seeking improved policy choices in their own countries. So we will see in a few minutes that beyond the aggregate index, which many want to focus on, the horse races so-called, beyond that, there's an enormous richness of the data at the very detailed and disaggregated country level. We now go to explain what basically we're talking about in terms of the sector. So we have two types of assessments for countries. For most countries, essentially, we assess either the oil and gas sector, for which we do it for 47 countries, or that's oil, that's gas with their own icon, or for the mining sector, and mostly copper, but also related to that, and that's in 26 countries. Then for 8 very important countries where we're very involved, we also assess both. So the grand total is 81 countries, but it actually is 89 different assessments, because within a country, among those 8, there are different assessments for oil and gas on the one hand, and mining on the other. We get now to see a preview of the index itself. And mindful that there are very different categories of performance for the sake of presentation, but also to signal that talking about groupings makes sense rather than pretending that there is extreme precision. We have first the very good set of countries in the category which we call it good, and the best performer being Norway, followed by Chile. For full disclosure, I'm a proud citizen of that country, then followed by UK, and then by Canada. Those 4 countries basically are the ones that make it to the good category. Even there, as we're going to see, there are some challenges, but those show many countries that the art of the possible. The next set of countries that we see here is in the satisfactory category, which is in lighter green, and they're called satisfactory. The next one is a weaker set, which is in the middle, and then we traverse further into the orange set of countries, ending with after the poor performers, which are the orange countries, and then ending with a set of 11 countries which are labeled as failing, which ends with Turkmenistan and Eritrea at the end. All these countries that we cover, these 81 countries, encompass almost 6 billion people that live there, out of whom almost 1.8 billion are poor, according to the cutoff of $3.10 per day. Half of that poor, namely about 900 million people, live in countries that do not have good or satisfactory governance. So they have weaker, poor, or failing governance standards. So that shows the magnitude of the challenge and why we're here today, why it matters. The weak, poor, and failing set of countries, as we see by the color coding here, covers over 80% of the countries. The silver lining, and Ernesto mentioned that, is that there is a set, close to 20% of the countries, that are doing fine, whether satisfactory and good. And it shows there is nothing predetermined about performing poorly because of resources, but it's still a minority. The stereotypes are being challenged by these results. Being very rich doesn't guarantee having high standards of resource governance. Of the dozen or so rich countries, 6 are in the Middle East and North Africa, and all fail to achieve good or satisfactory resource governance, which is something that we will discuss further, and we'll go into the panel, I'm pretty sure. Conversely, a number of not very rich countries, including, in fact, middle and low-income countries, are doing relatively well, including Brazil, India, Colombia, we mentioned Chile, which all are in the top 10, while many others, middle and lower-income countries, are struggling, as we say. So let us look deeper into country and regional diversity. And that's what we see in this world map of natural resource governance here, the enormous diversity around the globe. One important insight that comes out from the data is the risk of generalizing for a continent. Let's look at our own continent, Latin America. We have the whole spectrum between the dark green in the good category of Chile to the red of doing very poorly in Venezuela, for instance, or Venezuela versus Colombia, which is doing quite well. They're neighboring countries, yet performance is just so vastly different. That's not just in Latin America. If we click next into Africa, while it's still a bit of an exception, but we see countries like Botswana doing quite well. Next to it, Zimbabwe as a neighbor doing exactly the opposite. There are 2 countries that we see in this zoomed Africa that have stripes. The stripes are because there are two colors in essence. And that's because those are countries that had dual assessment. In the case of the DRC, the large country there in the middle, Congo, Kinshasa, they were doing a little bit better in terms of the assessment of their mining sector than the oil sector. In the case of Ghana, it's the other way around. Ghana, which does relatively well, as we see on the left, with some green, that green is the assessment of the oil and gas sector versus mining that doesn't do as well. Again, subject for further discussion and probing. In fact, this look into all these countries, and particularly the 8 countries where we see both sectors, reminds us about the enormous variation that can take place within a country, not just within a region, but within a country. So let us now drill further down in what matters the most, the country level. And this is what we see here. As an illustration, and I don't want to take too much of the time, so I will show only one country illustration here to illustrate the richness and the detail of the index without doing justice to all the detail. That's Colombia. It's Colombia oil and gas. There's also Colombia mining because it's a dual assessment. And we see that in front of us. Colombia, at a very high level, we start at 30,000 feet, performing well, scoring 71 points out of a possible maximum of 100 points. And that's what we see at the top. That's a composite RGI score. That's the aggregate measure of the degree to which resources are managed and accountable in a transparent manner for a country. This composite or aggregate score is the average of its 3 main components. The first 2 are totally focused within the extractive sector. The first is upstream, called value realization, which encompasses the governance in the upstream of the value chains, the legal and disclosure aspects in licensing, taxation, local impact, including environment, state-owned enterprises. The second, which you see in the middle, which is more midstream in the value chain, is revenue management, which includes budgeting, fiscal rules, subnational revenue sharing, the sovereign wealth funds, and so on. And then there's the third, on the far right, the third key component, which is the broader and national enabling environment, encompassing both the governance dimensions such as civic space or protection of civil society, open political system, rule of law, corruption control, and also open data, which is very, very important. A key finding studying all these countries, not just Colombia, is whether there is success or not in the first 2 components, on the extractive sector governance, very focused, captured by these first 2 components, value realization and revenue management. That success or failure seems to correlate mostly with one particular component in the broader enabling environment, namely open systems, freedoms, political freedom, and civic space. The whole voice and democratic accountability seems to be very important in explaining some of the results. Let's continue on this structure just for 30 seconds. There's much beyond these top-level scores, the 1 composite and the 3 components I just mentioned. As we see, if we drill down, there are 14 subcomponents. I'm not going to read them all, although I just suggested some. And then there's much more granularity, which is all in the web and in 10,000 documents, but also in a user-friendly fashion. There are 54 indicators, 133 questions for each country assessment. We note the large diversity within the country here. So even in countries that rate relatively well overall, like Colombia, in this case, it is mostly due to the stellar performance of the middle component. We see the green, which is revenue management, as opposed to the value realization, the earlier one, where there's still a room for progress, particularly on local impact, environmental disclosures, and related social impact issues. So that's a very key finding, which is also backstop if we look, for instance, at the case of Vietnam here. On both extremes, we see the lowest and the highest subcomponent rating for Vietnam, and it's in some sense inverse to Colombia. So each country has different challenges in terms of the revenue management, in this case, national budgeting particularly. It's very challenged with a score of 30, as opposed to a very high score of 88 for local impact, including the environmental disclosures. Nigeria is another case with very significant also variation of that. So there's a lot beyond those averages that are very important. The case of Nigeria, the lowest by far is the sovereign wealth fund management versus the taxation component on the more revenue management that is doing relatively well. Now, contrasting all these, that where we are talking about regulatory legal revenue management issues and so on, let's now discuss whether these are just rules in the books, regulatory and legal rules on the book, or what is happening in practice. In fact, both are important. So we assess both, and there are very interesting insights in that context, and that's what we see here. On average, and again, it's an average, we find that the legal framework in terms of the rules and laws and regulations in the book has an average score of 54. In practice, in terms of the implementation of that, that's significantly lower at 45. But much more important is the fact that for some type of countries, the gap is much, much larger. In fact, for countries that are performing relatively well, as we see here, there's almost no gap between the two. Countries that are doing well in the index in general, there is a congruence very much in the good and the satisfactory category between what's in the books and what's implemented in practice. Where it starts getting very challenging is on the weaker governance side, where some laws are being adopted increasingly, although there's still room for progress, as we see for the weak, but increasingly there is a gap vis-a-vis what's happening in practice on implementation. We also find that, in fact, that gap, the extent of that gap, is very much linked and related to the extent of corruption in a country. Countries that have managed to control corruption, then there's a much higher likelihood that there's implementation of the laws in practice. While where there's endemic corruption, there can be laws in the book, but they are not implemented. That's important in our field as well. And we find that there's a particular large gap in certain areas of extractive governance, such as with respect to environmental and social impacts, and the sharing arrangements of resource revenues regarding subnational government. So this is a real challenge at the local subnational level, which should be studied and discussed much more. Now, there's so much more. There are many findings here in the index, which I'm not going to spend time on for the sake of moving on today. For instance, on state-owned enterprises, some are performing excellently, such as mentioned already, Codelco in Chile versus some in the Middle East and other countries. And that's all in the web and for further discussion in the panel. But before having some concluding remarks, let me showcase in brief the results of one other key institution in extractive governance, which we do assess in depth as well, the sovereign wealth funds. Again, we see enormous variation here, and we see that at the top we have Colombia, Timor-Leste, and Ghana. So it shows that yes, we can, emerging economies can do well on a number of dimensions and institutions, among the highest performance. Yet, by contrast, once we get into the red area, the picture is very sobering. Among Among the non-performing ones, in the red fact, there are 11 funds which are red, which is a worst possible category, that account for $1.5 trillion in assets under management. The Qatar Investment Authority, with $330 billion in assets, Nigeria's excess crude account, were found to be particularly challenged even within that red category. We have to mention that in all these institutions, as well as in the index in general, the focus of our governance assessment is on transparency, disclosure, and accountability aspects of governance, not on the final financial results or managerial issues. So those are not covered by our index. Okay, lastly now, onto some implications. Again, I will not do full justice. Also in part because that should be part of the debate, discussion today and following up. So it's a very general level, expecting much more later. I will just exemplify the 6 points I want to make in each case without full coverage. First, on implementation. Obviously, as mentioned, strengthening the implementation of the laws and regulations in extractives is critical. And that's particularly we find as a weak area, the environment, local community areas, as we mentioned. Combating corruption is key to reduce that implementation gap. Second, open up transparency. In particular, shedding light on the true beneficial ownership of companies and the commercial interests of officials and their associates, and detailed project-level payments. Third, state-owned enterprises, strengthening the regulation and disclosure of oil sales, and essentially also shedding more light on commodity trades and commodity traders. That side is very, very important. As important is to establish independent governing boards and meritocratic systems for appointments in state-owned enterprises, focus on technical expertise rather than political patronage. Fourth, civic space and anti-corruption, opening civic space where citizens and journalists lack freedoms to speak up and hold their governments into account. That's under attack in dozen countries today. Strengthening rule of law, regulatory quality, and corruption control is key as well. Fifth, global norms, strengthening the global framework for natural resource governance, including how multinational companies behave. Global initiatives, like Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, need to go even further and work in this context and can help these countries to institutionalize extractive governance reforms within their country systems. Sixth, last but definitely not least, power of data. Use the data, assessing the quality of resource governance for policies and practice, developing institutional systems for public information, and adopt standards in line with Open Data Charter. In fact, regarding the power of data, there is a suite of publications and web-related access to help the engagement of everybody. I will not list it all, but just focus as concluding on 3 or 4. RGI 2017 country profiles for all that data is there, data visualization, and there's country context and reform priorities for dozens of countries. There is a major data bank housing 10,000 documents. There is a data explorer to encourage deep data dives and feedback to this. We have embraced the open data revolution as another leg in the quest for open and inclusive governance systems. So let's open this further up now. Thank you very much. Now we all go.
So thank you, Danny, for a fascinating survey of really the highlights. I think, as everybody is no doubt doing, as you're sort of processing the details, and as we will have the chance in the coming hours and days to look into the details, I think the richness of the next 2 or 3 levels of conversation, I think, will really be where a great deal of the benefit of this will come from. And hopefully this panel today gives us an opportunity to scratch a little bit deeper the surface of some of these issues. It's a great pleasure for me. My name is Sean Hinton, and as was said, I head up the Soros Economic Development Fund and Economic Advancement Program at the Open Society Foundations. I also have the privilege of sitting on the governing board of NRGI. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to the panel today. And let me go, if I may, from my right to left. Dr. Mohammed Amin Adam is the Deputy Minister of Energy in the government of Ghana. He is responsible there for developing Ghana's petroleum sector policies, and we look forward to hearing some more from him about that. To my right is Carole Nakhle, who's the founder and the CEO of Crystol Energy, a consultancy on energy and petroleum issues across the world. Carole is also a member of the NRGI Advisory Council, for which we're very grateful for her help and advice. To my left, Aidan Davy, who is the COO of the International Council on Mining and Minerals, ICMM, familiar to many in the room, an international organization dedicated to a safe, fair, and sustainable mining industry, and is another member of our advisory council. You can see we're keeping them hard at work today, and also very grateful to Aidan. And finally, on my left, Elisa Peter, the executive director of Publish What You Pay, familiar to many here as an organization dedicated to transparency in natural resources. And it's a great pleasure to welcome the members of the panel. Having had this introductory presentation, and before I turn to the panel, we thought we would just take a brief moment to get a little bit of a reaction from you in the audience. While this is primarily a session about data, about a factual and detailed reading of a fact base that is extremely hard for anyone really to get, except for the work that the team at NRGI does. Data is not everything. Perception is also important. And so what we thought we would do is very briefly, in just literally a minute, to get a sense from this room, a little bit of a response on a perception. Danny highlighted the 3 broad areas of the index, there being the value realization. I don't know if it's possible for that to come up again, but if not, not to worry. Value realization, the degree to which revenue is well managed, and finally, various aspects of the enabling environment that allow for the good governance of natural resources. And I wondered if we're going to use a highly sophisticated technology, an app that you all have with you, your arms. We were going to have an app and have people punching your smartphones. We're not. We're going to ask you to put your hands up. And for those on the webcast, my apologies. We can't see your hands. But we'll take a brief straw poll, and I'm going to just ask for a show of hands. For which of those 3 do people feel, from your perspective, in the countries and the places in which you're working, where you think really which of these 3 is the most important in terms of realizing the benefits of these resources? So we'll look at the details and where, the data suggests we are, but at a perception, based on what you know, based on the countries in which you work, let's take a straw poll and inform this discussion with your sense of where the focus should really be. So, once again, value realization, revenue management, or the enabling environment. So can I have a show of hands on value realization? Those who think this really is where the energy needs to be. And I'm going to ask my colleagues here to just make a quick guess of the numbers. Keep your hands up, and I'm just going to do a quick number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 20. All right, so we've got 20.
These are in page 8 and 9. Everybody has.
Great. You can see those 3 categories. And in page 7 is the big round index?
Right.
Yeah. So on page 7, you can just see very briefly what the components of this are. So we had, for value realization, revenue management. Let's see a show of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Keep them up, please.
Here.
Oh, they can't possibly be 20. Thank goodness. President Zedillo is a casting vote. That's 21. And finally, enabling environment. Those factors, there we go. Well, that's going to be, I'm going to win the majority, but let me count them anyway. 1, 2, 3. Okay, about as accurate as many of the recent elections we've had in the world, and as unpredicted as these have all been, that really gives us a very strong sense that those enabling environment factors really, hold sway. I want to pose another question before we go to the panel, and Danny has already led this one. So I'll in the presentation, Danny talked about the trade-off, if you like, or the relative importance of the legal framework versus the practice of implementation. And I think the recommendations from the report suggest that really the emphasis needs to be on implementation. Many people talk about the challenge of skill and will, the challenge of capacity in government and capacity in the country in terms of tackling these challenges versus the challenge of the political will, that there are the capabilities. People do know, they understand, they have the ability to do these things, but the political will is lacking to make these changes. And clearly that picture, that balance is different in many different places. But let me just ask for a show of hands as to where people think the greatest emphasis needs to be placed on skill, capacity building, versus tackling these difficult issues of political will. So a show for hands for skill first. 1, 2, 3, I think. 15, all right, versus political will. Where I have them here. Okay, that one we could have predicted. So I'm not going to count. That's all right. Well, thank you. That's interesting, and I hope we can sort of reflect on that and interested in the extent to which our panel may see a different, have a different perception. So, Dr. Adam, let me turn to you first. I think many of us noticed how well Ghana performed. Relatively, there are 2 scores in the RGI, and how well relatively that Ghana performed. You have had an interesting career in that you came from civil society and now in government. You've seen, as it were, you've been on both sides of this issue. And it would be interesting if you could reflect on these results and maybe say a little bit about what you felt were the real ingredients in reforming these aspects of transparency and accountability in Ghana, and what you think maybe the rest of us could learn from the experience of Ghana.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to NRGI for inviting me to be part of this very important occasion. First of all, I'm sure those who have listened to me in the past are going to be surprised about the positions I take, given that I have shifted camp. I've moved camp from civil society, where I used to be critical of government, to now working for the government and actually leading the government in areas that I was very critical of. But in spite of that, I see it to be continuity in our effort to govern our natural resources and the management of these resources better for the benefit of our people, whether you are coming from a civil society side or you're coming from the government side. It is important for us to have that partnership. And therefore, for those of us who had the benefit of working in civil society, we go in with a certain level of expertise, with a background that I think will help our country. And within this short period, some of the reforms we are seeing in the oil and gas sector bear testimony to this assertion. Having said this, I want to observe that, yes, Ghana has scored higher marks as far as the Resource Governance Index is concerned. But I also want to agree with Danny, who said that Ghana still faces very serious challenges on how we can better govern our resources. If I make reference to the scores, mining governance actually performed worse than it performed in the past. The Resource Governance Index in 2013 put Ghana on satisfactory score. The current index, 2017, put Ghana on a weaker score, which means that instead of making progress from where we were 3 years ago, mining governance is retrogressing. That's an important observation I'd like to make. But apart from this, we also see a significant gap between the score for oil and gas, or petroleum, if you like, and that of mining. There's about 9-point gap between the two of them. And I know why, which is well articulated by the index. Ghana's petroleum or oil and gas sector has a very good revenue management framework, yet we don't have any for mineral revenues. And therefore, if you go to our budget and you take various reports which are required to be issued by the government, indicating how much oil we're producing, how much oil government is lifting and the companies are lifting, the sales price, and then the distribution of the revenue, you will see that with petroleum revenues, but you don't see that with mineral revenues. With mineral revenues, it goes into the budget consumes that. There is no requirement for reporting except the EITI framework, which is not comprehensive in my view. And so the reason you find that gap between oil and gas governance and then mining governance, which, as I said, is well captured in the index, is the low or the poor performance we scored in the area of mineral revenue management. Having said this, I think that, as I indicated earlier, we have made some progress. We've chalked some successes. And I see one of the successes being in the area of the gap between policy and practice. In Ghana, you often hear that we are good at making good laws, but when it comes to the implementation of the laws, we are found wanting. I see from the index a 7-point gap between oil legislation and practice, which in my view is a better score, because if you talk to any Ghanaian, they will tell you that when it comes to practice, when it comes to implementing our laws, we are not doing well at all. And so for the index to point out a 7-point gap, I think that is a major success, and that should spur us on to even do more than we have done in the past. Also, there is national consensus in Ghana why we must govern our resources better. Coming from the experience of poor management of our mining sector, which is the older of the two, we did not want to repeat the mistakes we made in the mining sector when we discovered oil. And therefore, the level of attention the oil and gas sector received and the level of interest of citizens in how we manage the oil and gas sector actually led to the performance we see in the oil and gas sector compared to what we saw with the mining sector. But if you want to know the ingredients which led to these successes, there are two major of them. The first one is internal. And internal, the fact that Ghana's democratic development has moved from progress to progress, indicates the readiness and the willingness of the people to hold their governments to account. The willingness of the people to demand better governance, not just of the natural resources of the country, but of the country as a whole, is what has led to some of the successes we have chalked. I mean, I have come across a thesis that a good enabling environment before the discovery and exploitation of a resource is an important ingredient for better managing the resources. And Ghana is one good example of how that thesis works in countries. So Ghana had a good democratic dispensation, an accountable governance long before the discovery of oil. And therefore, the policy space has been open in Ghana, allowing for dialogue between civil society and government, allowing for scrutiny by the media, and even community-based organizations who just have little education. They are demanding of government the need for government to manage these resources well. But the second one, which is also a feature of our democratic development, is active citizenship. Ghanaians will never be quiet about anything in Ghana. They will never be quiet about anything in Ghana. And currently, as I sit here, there is an issue in Ghana relating to the release of contaminated petroleum products by one of our state agencies. And everybody in Ghana is consumed by this. That is an indication of how an enabling environment, how democratic development can help in the governance of resources of whatever kind in a country. And I see from the Resource Governance Index, Ghana scores highest, its highest score in voice and accountability, 90 out of 100. In terms of the rule of law, 83 out of 100. And this is a demonstration of the fact that enabling environment is an important ingredient in Ghana's management of its resources. The second one, external, Ghana's relationship with the world, with the rest of the world. And this is often seen through our relationship with international financial institutions. For instance, the IMF program with Ghana required the publication of the audited accounts of our national oil company. Since the national oil company was set up in the 80s, early 80s, they've never published their audited accounts until 2 years ago when Ghana entered into a program with IMF. This was news for most of us who have been working in the industry, that we now can see and read the audited accounts of our national oil company and be able to ask questions. It's never happened in Ghana before. And also, if you make reference to what we call MDBS, the multi-donor budgetary support, that was the first time we saw a group of donor agencies making the disclosure of oil contracts a condition for the release of funds. And that moved our government to accept contract disclosure as a norm. And so, both internally and externally, there have been forces, there have been factors that have urged Ghana on in the good governance of particularly the oil and gas sector. Let me quickly go through some observations, some lessons for other countries. Number one, strong accountable governance has greater impact on sector governance. And this is what I explained earlier. But two, active citizenship and an open policy space will not necessarily destabilize the political system. In other African countries, civil society actors are being arrested by their government, they are being jailed, they are driven out of the country. But Ghana shows that even where there is active citizen participation, government become more stable. The Resource Governance Index shows that. Voice and accountability score of 90 versus political stability and absence of violence of 78. So there is that strong correlation between them. Also, the more diversified an economy, the better they have control over governance. And again, when I look at the index, I see that Nigeria, for instance, in terms of their export structure, has 92% of the export structure from oil and gas. Their Resource Governance Index score is 55 out of 100. Zambia, copper. The export structure has copper constituting 67%. Their score on the index is 40. Ghana has 44 gold in our export structure, and then oil, 12%, and our score is 13. And so again, I see that trend, that the more diversified an economy, the better the governance of the resources in that country. I'll end here and then continue later if more questions come.
I feel horrible doing that because actually I think we could dive into so many of those questions just about Ghana and learn so much. And I think, what you said, Dr. Adam, about this discrepancy and unpacking for us what might be behind the difference between, say, oil and gas and mining, I think we're going to find that. I think there are 8 countries in total in the cohort in which 2 sectors are managed where there is that sort of significant discrepancy or a very different score showing. So I hope we can return to that. Thank you very much. Carole, I wonder whether you, another divide on which there are, stark differences is within regions. And I know in the region in which you work, for example, the governance scores between the Middle East and North Africa are quite stark and quite sort of different in many places. Can you help us understand some of those differences and either what lessons we can learn from the better performers, but also what do we need to understand about those that are lagging behind?
Yeah, when I looked at the scores and the ranking of the NRGI index, I was a bit disappointed because I come from the Middle East. And because if you look at the whole MENA region, I hope my numbers are as accurate, actually a little bit more accurate than you're counting, that none of the 14 or roughly 14 countries included falls into the category of good or satisfactory. They are all in the weak or failing, and that is very disappointing to see. But if I just bore you, I would just reflect some data. Actually, if you look with me through the report, you can see very sharp contrast between various countries across the region. So Tunisia, for instance, for oil ranks 26. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have Saudi Arabia ranking 69, not to mention Libya, which ranks very poorly, but I'll leave Libya on the side for now. You also find differences between neighbors themselves. Earlier, Danny mentioned some neighboring countries in Latin America, but take, for instance, Tunisia and Algeria. Tunisia, again, 26, Algeria, 73. Or Saudi Arabia, 69, Kuwait, 33. Not only that, within the same country, and in this case, Tunisia, you find 2 different rankings. One which is relatively good for oil, 26, and then for mining, it is 48. So that's a major difference in my opinion. Now, of course, we have to remember that when we talk about the MENA region, the Middle East, Africa, we're not talking about a coherent region. We have a big variety, not just in terms of the index, but also in terms of political system, in terms of the current status. For example, I mentioned Libya earlier. You know what's happening in Libya, just like Yemen. You have the civil war and the unrest is still ongoing. You also have differences in the importance of the oil and gas sector to the economy. And here I'm mentioning oil and gas more than mining because I think only few countries, they have a prominent mining sector in the region. So it's mainly about oil and gas sector or industry in the region. But we also, if there is one striking observation that comes to my mind is that I notice, not only from the MENA region, but globally from the index, that the more liberal and participatory a system is, the better the ranking. And the more autocratic and closed system that you have, the lower the ranking. And that is perhaps a very important lesson for all the other countries to learn from. And when I talk also about participatory systems, I also want to refer to an important issue, which is open debate. You know, there are countries where, I travel a lot in the MENA region, and there are countries where we cannot have these kind of open debates. Such open debates, they don't necessarily provide a solution or the answer, but open communication allows exchange of ideas, exchange of expertise, exchange of knowledge. And like this, you avoid this kind of speculative opinions that can lead to very big diversions in the judgment. And I feel that in the countries that rank poorly, this kind of open debate is still lacking. Now, what can be learned from this ranking? I think there are many lessons to existing oil and gas producers and mineral producers as well, and also to newcomers, Lebanon, for example, where I come from, and they are soon to embark on their first licensing round offshore. So the first lesson for me is that, hey guys, being open is not too bad. Some governments, they don't want to go down that route because they are worried about the impact, the negative impact that this can have on their society or their economy or their country. And actually, the risk is pretty low. In my opinion, the benefit, long-term benefit, outweigh by far any risk that these countries can see. And also, I want to go back to Tunisia for a second, because that was striking. Dr. Mohammed, you mentioned also oil and mining in Ghana, but the same thing applies in Tunisia, where I think there are lessons that Tunisia can learn from the way it's running its oil sector and apply them on the mining sector in order to improve the ranking of the mining sector. So that's another dimension that we can have. And finally, I think being open and being able to discuss these issues so openly is the way forward. This is the long-term trend. It's not like a fashionable thing that's going to become outdated soon. And I think if countries want to really join modern societies and develop economies that don't rely solely on oil and gas revenues or minerals, then this is the starting point, I would say, for long-term success.
Thank you, Carole. That's fascinating, and I think we'll return to some of those issues as well. I'm going to turn to Aidan and Elisa, but I want to encourage you in the audience. Once we've done this, I'm going to invite questions from the audience. I'd be grateful if you can sort of have a think and prepare some of the questions, and we will also be turning to any that may come in from the webcast audience via Twitter. Aidan, you work obviously with the industry, and I think it's not controversial to say that not all mining companies see it as part of their remit or their responsibility to really engage on improved governance in the countries that they work. Clearly, those that are members of ICMM have self-selecting into those that see that as an importance and as a priority. So I wonder whether you could help us understand a little bit about what lies behind that different performance and the different perception of roles that, that people see from the industry. And what's the influence on that, and how do we get traction on that issue?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sean. And also thanks to the organizers for the invitation to be here. It's just over 4 years ago that I sat in the audience at the EITI Global Conference in Sydney, where the first edition of the Resource Governance Index was launched by you, Danny. And it's a great pleasure to be here today for this event. I guess it's because certainly, ICMM and the member companies of ICMM see value in engaging in governance debates. And I think we do that for three main reasons. Firstly, because good governance, as far as we're concerned, offers the prospect of developing projects and operations that are more likely to enjoy the support of the host communities and the host government, and that is very, very important. And I think that's for a few reasons. At its most basic, governance relates to the institutions, the legal frameworks, the standards, and the disclosure mechanisms that either help mitigate the adverse impacts of projects in this sector or to realize the benefits of projects. And so on that basis, I think good governance can really help create those conditions where it is possible to gain the support of host communities. A second reason really relates to the ability of good governance to underpin investment returns. And I mean returns both to the investor, but crucially returns to the host government. So mining and metals companies are long-term investors. They are typically there for decades, not for years. And with good governance comes predictability and stability and the confidence to be able to take a really long-term perspective to investment. So I think that's another critical reason. And then the third reason is because ICMM is dedicated to working with responsible mining companies and collaborating with others to enhance the contribution of mining and metals to sustainable development. Without governance, we know that the full potential of the sector to contribute to broader-based economic and social progress will not be realized, and therefore we see it as important to engage in governance debates. I guess on that point of where do we think mining companies have the greatest influence, my own view is that companies have the greatest influence where they act collectively rather than unilaterally. And the ICMM model is really one of collective action. Members together take policy positions on issues related to responsible mining. And the power of 23 major companies And those companies represent somewhere between 30 to 50% of global production of major commodities. Taking a progressive position on issues related to responsible mining can be a really significant driver of change. For example, since 2003, it's been a requirement that ICMM members should be supporters of EITI, and that's a condition of membership of ICMM. More recently, the mining industry board members of the EITI were really instrumental in getting the issue of beneficial ownership onto the agenda of EITI, and ultimately having that adopted as a requirement in the 2016 EITI standard. Similarly, the mining industry, I think, was the first to really push for EITI to report on subnational transfers of revenues, which is critically important in the mining and metal sector. And that was all about enhancing the accountability of those revenues, and that now is part of the EITI standard since 2013. In 2009, we released a policy position on the transparency of mineral revenues, and that requires a number of things of members, including to engage constructively in public policy debates to improve or enhance either mineral revenue transparency or transparency around contract disclosure. It also requires members to support the public disclosure of material payments by country and by project. And then lastly, I would say, there is an impact on that slice of the pie, the area that when Danny put up that circle that shows all of the issues that are factored into the index. There's one around local impact, and critically, that is where it is important that companies exhibit very high standards of environmental and social responsibility. That's an area I think we've been incredibly active. We've embraced progressive policy positions, whether it's on biodiversity, indigenous peoples, water, et cetera, to really show the art of the possible. So let me stop there, but I think those are some of the key governance areas where you can have, and we have had an impact.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you. I'm intrigued to hear you describe most of the sort of factors driving or that sit behind those companies' engagement on governance as being essentially internal ones. I mean, there's sort of the internal long-term, sort of stability of the volatility of the sort of the ability to gather returns, the sort of social license to operate, etc. Less about pressure from activists, less about pressure from the public or shareholders or others. That's interesting. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that and where and whether you see, those external influences coming over time. Finally, let's turn to Elisa, who really, gives us I think the most clear focus on that area of the enabling environment and on those factors that Publish What You Pay works on. The RGI shows that governments are open in some areas but less in others. So clearly within a country and within the single government, there's significant inconsistency or gaps rather. What do you see? Where is Publish What You Pay going to sort of focus going forward? Where do you see the next area or the next sort of frontier is? And to the extent I think this is a room filled with those who are keen to be supportive. And what does Publish What You Pay need to achieve on those factors?
Great, thank you, Sean, and it's a great honor to be here and to participate in the launch of the index. So thank you very much for the invitation. So what we've seen in the index is that there's definitely been amazing progress in at least one area, which is fiscal transparency. So that's the disclosure of revenues that are generated by the sector. And the index shows that there are 45 countries now today that disclose company-level information. So information about how many royalties and fees and taxes and license fees they've received from companies. And I think the ITI definitely deserves credit on that one, because I think they've really contributed a lot to that evolution. There's definitely areas where we think government can and should do more, and I'm just going to highlight two of them right now. So the first one is contract transparency. So the disclosure of the terms of the agreements that governments sign
with a particular company. By and large, those are still not available for public scrutiny. So the index lists 22 countries that actually have laws in place requiring disclosure of extractive contracts. But if you actually look at the data, only 8 have disclosed all the extractive licenses and contracts that they've signed. And so why is this important? Well, because we're talking about public scrutiny here and having a democratic and open public debate about how natural resources are governed and how we can ensure that they lead to sustainable and equitable development and poverty eradication. If you don't have access to those terms of the agreement, then citizens cannot hold companies and governments to account. So Publish What You Pay will continue to push for disclosure of those contracts in those countries that actually have laws requiring contract disclosure. In those countries that don't have laws, we'll push for those laws to be in place. And we'll also campaign for the contracts to be readily available, so quite easily accessible to the public. And when I talk about contract, it's not just the agreement itself, it's all the annexes. So for instance, environmental impact assessment, social impact assessments, if and how consultations have been conducted with communities that are affected by an extractive project, whether there has been free, prior, and informed consent given by local communities for such a project, because that's what we're really talking about, right? Like, is the citizenry enabled and empowered to take part in those decision-making processes? So besides contract transparency, the index tells us one other thing that governments are not doing quite well at the moment, and that's about commodity trading. So what's commodity trading? That's basically the sale of oil, gas, and minerals by state-owned enterprises, but also by big extractive companies. So what the index tells us is that today only 11 state-owned enterprises disclose some kind of information about who bought their oil and mineral resources. So that's important not only because of the risk of corruption around those trading deals, but also just because of the amount of money involved. And another piece of NRGI research has shown that, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, the 10 top oil-producing countries together sell oil for about $250 billion over the course of 2 years. I think it was 2011 to 2013. That represents the vast majority of those governments' revenues. Yet, we don't know where that money is going. Shell's mandatory disclosure report for 2016, which was just published, shows that 2/3 of Shell's payments to government are actually production entitlements, so barrels of oil. There again, we don't know who's buying the oil, we don't know who the beneficial owners of those buyers are, and how the money is used. I think the index really shows that this is an area of great opacity at the moment, yet one that, if it is addressed, has the potential to really curb corruption in the sector and make sure that those revenues are used towards poverty education, invested in social services like health and education, and have the potential, I think, to increase the social license that mining and oil companies enjoy or not in those countries where they operate.
Fascinating, thank you. I think the area of commodity trading and how those contracts are handled is such an important area. I have my fingers crossed that we may have people from from that industry here who are prepared to sort of get into that discussion. It would be fascinating, and thank you very much, Elisa. So I'm going to open it up now. I'm going to hope that we have questions bursting to come forward. We'll take 2 or 3 in a run, and then give the panel the opportunity to respond to some or all of those. The hashtag that is being used, I'm sure, is trending extraordinarily right now, is Resource Governance Index. Hashtag Resource Governance Index. I doubt that my teenage daughters are using it as we speak, but hopefully those on the webcast are. and we'll be able to uncover it on Twitter later. But let me open it up. We have people with mics, and we have our first question in the back. And do we have a mic at the back? Yes, could you go to the gentleman at the far left at the back? And then if you could offer one here. Maybe you've got it, if you could start for us. And can I ask you just to introduce where you're from, what part of the industry, as it were, you're in?
Yeah, Simon Trace. I'm from Oxford Policy Management. We run a number of consulting contracts around, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, around sort of governance in the oil sector. Thank you very much for the presentations. They were really interesting. But what we haven't really heard much about today is trends, differences between scores in the first edition and the second edition. And I wonder whether that's because there isn't much change in scores overall, or it's difficult to pick out trends. But if there's anything that can be said about sort of exemplars, high flyers, or countries that have moved significantly, or countries that have fallen back significantly, I think that would be really interesting to hear.
Great, thank you very much. Up at the back.
But Danny's not going to answer?
He is. We're going to take 2 or 3 questions, and Danny will come in. I have no doubt. I'll have.
As chairman of the board, I demand it.
As your humble servant, I agree.
Hi, I'm Leif Winar. I'm from King's College London, the author of a book called Blood Oil. And congratulations on this exercise. This is fantastic, and it's so valuable for us working and needing an index like this. I was one of the people who voted for enabling environment is so important, and I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about one of the subcomponents, which is control of corruption. Looking through the scores, I noticed that Saudi Arabia has a satisfactory enabling environment, and in fact has a better enabling environment than, say, Argentina. And I can see how, when it comes to government effectiveness and regulatory quality, Saudi would do well, but I'm wondering how it does on this sub-index of control of corruption. And that just is an open question. What do you mean by corruption here? And does Saudi end up coming out well on that or poorly on that? It really makes a big difference on how we understand that particular term.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Is there one more? One more at the back, and then I'll hold the others right in the back row, and then I'll come to you if we can for the next round.
Hello, I'm a postgraduate student at the London School of Economics, and I have a question, particularly on the index that covers the part of voice and accountability and political stability and absence of violence, which also sound really similar to the ones of the World Bank Governance Quality Index that we've been seeing in the last 10 years. And I have a question. Something that surprised me is that the categories of Latin America, we see a lot of countries that run really good, such as Colombia, Peru, Brazil, but those are countries that recently have got a lot of scandals in terms of oil concessions, kickback schemes. So I wonder if maybe things like a free press, which is working really good in a lot of countries in Latin America to some standards, but that they have a really poor rule of law is kind of bringing this sort of average score, but not really gathering what is really happening within those countries.
Okay, great. So the questions were about trends, about the enabling environment, and specifically trying to dig into sort of corruption and what the role of corruption is, and then finally Latin America and understanding some of these issues and what might be behind some of the scores that we see. I'm going to try and involve the panel as well, otherwise many of us want to sort of interrogate Danny and put him on the spot and just have him tell us what's behind, and then he'll turn to his team, and you'll have the whole of NRGI up here before long. So let me begin, though, Danny, if you wouldn't mind, as I think you're really qualified amongst us to talk a little bit about the trends. Would you say a little bit about that for us?
And in fact, that's very straightforward. Deliberately, we discourage straightforward comparisons because the good news is that we embarked on a major effort, as President Zedillo suggested, to improve over the 2013, which was more of a pilot. And in fact, is much more encompassing, not just in terms of countries, but in terms of the issues covered, the whole revenue management. There are many new aspects that were not there before, as well as improving the depth and the detail that we go into each aspect and question. So in essence, it's not comparable. The idea would be then to lock this one up, and the next one would be fully comparable. Just regarding the other questions, I'm not going to answer. I think it's for the debate, but also to say this today is the first. We like very much to engage afterwards on an online debate through, through basically Google chat rooms as well as Twitter, and we'll be informing on that, including on methodological issues and so on. Let me just note that Saudi Arabia rates very, very poorly in general, and it was featured in the Financial Times today, and we can discuss the methodological issues around some of the governance ratings.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think I'm going to really open it to the panelists to take which of those they like. Elisa, I don't know if you want to on corruption or on Saudi. Carole, do you want to lead us off?
Not on Saudi Arabia, because I'm not an expert, but just, well, maybe on trends also, even though that may not be reflected in the index. I think, so if you look at the pie, on the kind of value realization and disclosure of revenue, I think we've definitely seen a positive trend since the last RGI in 2013, where an increasing number of revenues are being made transparent and disclosed. So both through the EITI, which now has more than 52 countries implementing the initiative, but also through the mandatory disclosure laws, which I mentioned a minute ago, which cover today some 80% of the large publicly listed extractive industry companies. We now have access to hundreds of billions of dollars that are disclosed through those mechanisms. So I think the trend is definitely a positive one on that front. On the enabling environment, and I would say especially the voice and accountability and control of corruption, I think the trends are, maybe less positive over the past few years. I think we're definitely seeing on the voice and accountability, especially a pushback against citizens and activists and our own members at Publish What You Pay, who are asking sometimes uncomfortable questions about where the money's gone and how the revenues generated by extractive operations have been used. So, I got a call a couple of weeks ago from Niger, where one of our board members had been arrested, in direct conjunction with some of the questions he had about revenues generated by the uranium extraction in Niger. So, and that's not an isolated case. Ali was, an EITI board member previously, and we're seeing a systematic pushback from governments who are not willing or able to disclose much further information. So I think we're at a critical juncture in the campaign where, we've gotten a lot of the information we've been asking for the past 15 years. We have a lot of data availability. How do we, transform that into real accountability, into behavioral changes in the sector? So less corruption, less bribery, less illicit financial flows, less tax evasion. How is that increasing availability of information and data translating into our collective capacity as citizens of using that information to bring about behavioral changes and better governance of the sector? That's one of the key questions in front of us, I think, today.
Great, thank you.
I would say a few words on Saudi Arabia question. It's not only Saudi Arabia. I was looking at the table, and actually there are a few countries which are overall in the orange or dark orange and the red, no, not in the red, in the orange, but they also score green and under the enabling environment score. It happened, one of them, Saudi Arabia, it catches our eyes because they are one of the largest, biggest oil producers in the world and the biggest holder of, second biggest holder of proven oil reserves. I haven't studied the computation of the scores in detail, but my immediate reaction would be, when were these scores computed? Over a period of the last 2-3 years, perhaps? And what happened to the oil price during this period? You see, so what we noticed, it's a global trend, when you have a weakening in commodity prices, in this case, important commodity that is oil, in countries, in economies which are mainly dependent on oil revenues, we see there is suddenly a new economic reform agenda being pursued. And Saudi Arabia itself launched a very ambitious reform agenda, and they have shown so far commitment to that agenda. And one of the major steps that they are going to do is the IPO of a small share of Saudi Aramco. Now, of course, you cannot go down that route and hoping to build the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, which is estimated to be double the size of the current sovereign wealth fund, and largest petroleum sovereign wealth fund in the world. So it would be very difficult for a country to go down this route without implementing some serious reforms to improve the enabling environment on various fronts. I'm not saying that Saudi Arabia doesn't have anything more to do. They have a lot to work on. And actually, I am disappointed in a sense that they have been producing oil for decades now, and still when the oil price falls, we have all sorts of economic problems facing not only Saudi Arabia, but the other major oil producers all around the world, especially in the developing countries. So they have a lot to do, but they have initiated an economic reform and social reform on a bigger scale, partly because they want to shield the economy from the vagaries of the changes in the oil market, but there's also the social pressure dimension which is mounting. Don't forget the whole region, the MENA region, they have a rapidly growing young population. And the oil sector on its own cannot capture or create enough jobs for this important part of the population. So you need to do something into your economy. You need to revisit your systems if you want to maintain political stability. And what happened also with the Arab Spring that officially started in Tunisia and spread to other countries also put an additional pressure on these countries to revisit their old model, because they realize that their old model is not going to be that sustainable anymore under these conditions. So that's my own interpretation at first glance, but perhaps the NRGI team can tell us more about the details of the scoring.
So did I understand what you were saying, that in a declining commodity price environment, that there is a greater appetite among government for leaning into reform and to governance improvement?
This has been the trend, but the sad part is that when commodity prices or oil prices increase again, kind of many of these reforms are being forgotten, and this is a big risk.
So I wanted to sort of pick up on, Dr. Adam, you made an interesting point about how important it was that before the real sort of discovery and realization of Ghana's resources, that the democratic sort of governance framework had been put in place, and then that was sort of there as a protection when I suppose the price and the realization of those commodities happened. Do you feel that same relationship is there, that in declining price environments that in Ghana you see that same reaction, that appetite for that sort of reform?
Yeah, I mean, of course, when prices are declining, the incentive for cutting deals, is also reduced. And therefore, it provides an opportunity for government to push through whatever reforms government should be pushing through. But also because most resource-rich countries over the last decade got substantial amount of rent from their resources, but which have not translated into tangible development for their people. When prices are declining, then the people begin to see how they have been robbed of an opportunity for development, and therefore they begin to demand accountability. They begin to demand to know what the revenue have been used for, and that put another pressure, some form of pressure on the government to want to tell them that we can do better, we can do things right. And so I agree, when prices are declining, it provides opportunity for better reforms. But let me touch a little on the corruption issue. I noticed that except Ghana, which scored higher on the control of corruption, most African countries featured on the index did not score well on corruption. But that is not surprising because recently I had opportunity to look at some of the petroleum laws of various African resource producing countries. And what I noticed is that most of the corruption comes from licensing, as she rightly said, from the concessions that are given to companies. because the process for allocating such rights is not transparent. Unfortunately, if you review all the laws, all of them provide for the use of open and competitive procedure for allocating rights. But that is often undermined also by provisions for direct negotiation. And I see these countries apply direct negotiation as the norm rather than the exception. And this is why you see most of the corruption coming from the licensing. And therefore, Ghana is no exception. I'm really surprised we have been scored that high, you know, as far as control of corruption is concerned. We want to do better. And this is why the government, only 2 weeks ago, agreed to introduce a new requirement for companies that want to come into our oil and gas sector. They must be listed on recognized stock markets, because we believe that most of the recognized stock markets are well regulated. They have corporate ethical requirements which companies listed must comply with. And if you are not on any such recognized stock market, you will not be pre-qualified in the first place to bid for any oil block in Ghana.
Very interesting. I want to turn to you, Aidan, on this question of the relationship between price and governance. You know, at the moment in which we get to the bottom of the cycle and, you know, governments turn to governance reform in the face of sort of domestic pressure in the political economy, of course, the members of ICMM, you know, arguably the private sector loses the mandate to internally, or at least, you know, many of the resources dry up for precisely this kind of work. Is that fair? Is there a sort of a swing that happens, and during those times the private sector actually loses interest and focus on this issue? Presuming that it's not universally good the whole time, I'm sure you're not going to...
Yeah, look, I think probably the reverse is true. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I absolutely recognize the dynamic that both Carole and Mohammed have kind of laid out in terms of, you know, what's driving government reforms. But actually what happens in a low commodity price environment is that you know, capital becomes more discerning. And so companies are making, I think, probably tougher choices around capital allocation. And one of the things they look at is, you know, the governance context into which they're investing. And so ironically, at the same time as you have a greater appetite for governance reforms, perhaps in countries that are most in need of it, the appetite of companies to invest in those countries may be lower.
So there's a flight to quality.
There is a flight to quality, and I think there is a little bit of a risk in some ways of a degree of disaffection on the part of countries who have made efforts to invest in governance reforms if we don't see a turning of the commodity prices such that the ability to reinvest into those sort of spaces, I think, is stronger. Just on very briefly on two of the questions. On the corruption question, nothing to say on Saudi Arabia, but more generally, I mean, one of the extraordinary kind of power, you know, the powerful piece of this index is the underlying data and the ability of someone who's as data unsavvy as me to interrogate that. And so, you know, I think that's what's extraordinary about the index and what it does. And if, you know, as I was playing with it last night, I noticed that you get this almost perfect straight line correlation, a statistician's dream between control of corruption and rule of law. The correlation coefficient is 0.94. So I think there is the ability to go in and look very, very hard at individual countries and see where do they sit on this. And that, I think, is part of the power of the index. The other point is invariably some degree of comparison, I think, will happen, Danny, except the proposition that the methodological basis has changed. And I think that's fine. But equally, you can probably get a directional sense even between the two indices as well. So don't obsess about the numbers, but you might get some sense of distinctions and movements between the different categories. And so in the mining sector, I think, as you've rightly pointed out, you know, Ghana perhaps dropped a category, but of the 10 countries, there were 24 mining countries out of the 34 that were included this time round in the 2013 index. Of those 24, 10 have changed relative position, and 9 of them have moved up a notch. 3 have moved from the weak to the satisfactory category. 3 have moved from poor to weak, and 3 have moved from failing to poor. So I think as a directional sense of progress, this should be very encouraging.
Now, the one question that we didn't tackle was from our colleague at LSE on Latin America and the relationship between, you know, the free press and the rule of law and the ability of civil society to put pressure on governments and to sort of uncover some of these issues in the public domain. Do you think I might invite you
to get in trouble
as my chairman of the board? No, but could I ask you, Ernesto, whether you would comment on this?
Well, I think the index, the results of the index are quite consistent with what we observe, let's say, politically in Latin America. We have had, over the last quarter of a century, a dramatic improvement in the quality of our democracies. In some countries, for example, Brazil, we moved from having a military dictatorship from the mid-60s until the 80s to have a very vibrant, participatory, competitive democracy. Still with very serious problems. As we speak, Brazil is going through a dramatic political crisis because the question of rule of law and corruption is having serious political consequences. Nevertheless, Brazil is a democracy. And in fact, even these scandals are proving that it is a democracy where the judiciary, one of the important checks and balances, one important institution, is working. And I think that is reflected in the index. Of course, our star in Latin America, which is Chile, by far, in many ways, is perfectly reflected in the index, you know, above the United States. I feel so proud about that. I almost feel like Chilean, right? You see Colombia, where we have seen enormous progress also in their democratic politics. And Colombia has been making enormous progress here. I spoke, without giving names, about the most dramatic case, not only in Latin America, I would say it's the most dramatic case in the world. It's almost a unique case in history, where a country that has an incredibly positive external shock, because it's like winning the lottery without buying even the ticket, gets these huge revenues. And on the one hand, it starts to undermine its own oil industry, getting rid of the human capital and other non-tangible capital in that industry. It starts using the revenues to practice populist policies that historically have been proven to be a failure in Latin America and in other parts of the world. But not only that, it starts to undermine the very fabric of democracy. And now we are seeing, you know, that this economy has contracted over the last 3 or 4 years, almost 40%. And per capita income is a fraction of what it was only 5 years ago. They are on the border of hyperinflation. Poverty has increased dramatically. And all of this was preceded by this extraordinary boom. And I would say at the heart of this problem was the undermining of the democracy of this country. And now they have this very sad political crisis that we hope will be solved, we wish will be solved in a constitutional way. But one thing we know is that things cannot continue as they are today for too long.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me open up again to another round of questions. There was one here, and I'm turning to Twitter as well, and we have one over here, and we'll do those. Can you start for us? Thank you.
Yes, thanks. My name's Eddie Rich. I'm from the EITI. I was going to actually pick up on that question about trends, but Carole, you actually sort of answered what I was, or made the point I was going to make, that the big difference between this index and the one 4 years ago, of course, is the commodity price. But you came to a bit of a different conclusion from the one that I think that we observe a lot in the EITI. I think whilst I agree in countries which are already resource-rich, which are already producing a lot, which are already getting a lot of money in from the sector, yes, the downturn perhaps creates some space for political reform and economic reform. In countries, and here I'm thinking more about East Africa, which weren't really producing very much but had enormous potential and were very excited about the whole resource boom 3 years ago, I feel that the momentum's gone out of reform process to some extent. There's a lost opportunity. And even in the countries, and Deputy Minister Adam, you said this as well, even in countries where there is a bit of, there has been producing a lot, the situation of so much debt, so much deficit, which is now caused by the commodity fall, means that some of this work the reform can get crowded out by the more immediate sort of political priorities. Anyway, my question is, so what's the message now? What should change in terms of the message towards political will and political reform in the sector that was different from 4 years ago? Have we got it right?
Okay, fascinating. Thank you. So a sort of a race to the bottom effect that happens, if you like, which is actually, or at least the danger of that. Interesting. From online, and then we'll come over here.
Yeah, I've been monitoring a few different conversations online, and I should mention that there's many other events happening today in several countries where NRGI works that are dedicated to the index and where they're talking about country-level specific results. And some consternation seems to be emerging online around the poor performance of some national state-owned enterprises and national oil companies. And a few sort of people on Twitter have been saying, how can we do better? One example is Uganda, which does receive a very low score in the index for its NOC, but it should be noted, of course, that this oil company has only just begun and has not actually produced anything. So we note that in a note in the index. But what can struggling state-owned enterprises do in terms of key actions? I think Dr. Adam, President Zedillo, perhaps one of you could comment on this and give some counsel to those who are a bit worried about their state-owned enterprise scores as they've seen them today.
Right, interesting. Thank you. And here. And then if I can ask those other hands, if we can get the mics to them, we'll come back to you. I'll do 3 at a time. We'll come in the next round. Could you? It is. Not very loud, though, but it's on. Can everyone hear?
No.
The blue microphone is a little low for our technical colleagues. We'll try again.
Hello? Oh,
Perfect.
good. Okay.
Thank you very much.
I'm Rosalind Kenya from Keen Advisory, and I wrote my question down so that I don't miss a word. I voted for revenue management and skills development, and my question is for Mohammed. Well done. I'm very proud of you, actually. How much do you believe that the economic empowerment of Ghanaians led to an increase in their knowledge and ability to take a robust interest in the oil and gas industry, and therefore hold the government to account and continue to do so? And I ask this because I believe that effective revenue management that contributes to a diversified economy, as you say, and an inclusive economy, then leads to citizens being able to have the space of mind and time and intellectual ability to demand from their governments the enabling environment and value realization. That are the other 2 components of the index.
Great
and
question.
Any other member of the panel can
Great
also
question.
answer.
So the importance of voice and of citizen voice in providing this.
To be able to voice.
And the empowerment of citizens to be able to participate in that and exercise that agency. Great question. So let me turn to the panel. We've got 3 on the table from EITI I'm sorry, I can't remember, but from EITI again, on this commodity relationship, from Twitter on the role of SOEs and sort of what can we do to improve, and finally on empowering citizen voice. Anyone on the panel want to kick us off?
I can start.
I'm tempted to ask you. Thank you, Dr.
Let me start with the SOE question for the newly established state-owned enterprises. There are three key ingredients that you need to be able to build in your SOEs, state-owned oil companies, that will lead to better performance by those companies and to bring value to their countries. First of all, corporate governance. What I see in most African countries is that the governments have so much control on the management decisions of the state enterprises. And so to the extent that government can direct them to do what commercially is not good or prudent for the company can undermine the performance of the company. Number two is financial independence from government. Usually, the law should specify how the state enterprise is going to be funded, either from the resource revenue, or they are going to be allowed to keep part of the profit that they make. There are various options of financing resource enterprises, and I know that NRGI has done a lot of work in this area. But where governments can go behind to take money from the state enterprises, that also undermines the value of the state enterprise as well as their work. And I'd like to give the example of Nigeria and Ghana, where the Nigerian National Oil Company had to buy, most of the things the central government needed, including the presidential, airplane. And in Ghana, where the government had to borrow $50 million from the National Oil Company, which they haven't paid back up till to date. And so if they don't have that financial independence from government, and government can, fall on resources meant for the work of the national oil companies, that also affects their progress. And the third one is also whether the companies focus on their core mandate or they expand into other activities which are not central to the purpose for which they were set up. And therefore, for most of the newly established state enterprises that want to go beyond exploration and development and production of oil, to do other things like investing in the hospitality industry, investing in other industries that are not core to their mandate, they could lose focus. They also could lose investment if the returns they are expecting from those investments tend to be volatile. And therefore, for African countries that want to promote the establishment of state enterprises, especially for the resource sector, they need to be guided by some of these fundamental features that will ensure that they properly manage these companies and the companies bring value to their countries. Then quickly, the question by Rosalind. By the way, thank you for the commendation. I believe it's because we are both Ghanaians and we are celebrating our country's success here. I think that in terms of the impact of the oil revenues, I don't think Ghanaians have been empowered enough, because the resources or revenue from oil hasn't been that much. Just 6% of the national budget is not so much. And in addition, we have invested this money thinly across so many projects. And so the impact you want to see in communities, for instance, that are affected by extraction, you don't see that. Also because we see the resource as a national asset, and as a unitary state, they must be shared equally across the country, whether we're producing these resources in your area or not. And so that has tended to deny some of the communities that have interfaced with extraction their share of the national cake. And because of that, we still are getting a lot of complaints and concerns from these communities, We are also getting complaints and concerns from other communities who are not seeing the benefits of how far we have used the petroleum revenues. And this is why the government today has decided to change course. Instead of spreading the revenue thinly, that people will not see the impact, projects are not completed. You suffer cost overruns as a result of time overruns in the execution of projects. We have decided to concentrate on 3 areas. Education, this year, most of the oil revenue are going to education, because we believe that if you use the revenue to build the human resource base of the country, that can give us medium to long-term effect on the overall development of our country. Then we also want to do railway as well as road infrastructure. So these are the 3 areas. And there are specific projects that we want to apply the money to, and not to spread thinly across so many projects, that the impact will not be felt.
Thank you. Danny, did you want to come in? And then I'm going to ask, were you giving me a sign? Were you? No?
Yeah, at the end.
Carole, would you?
Yeah, on the issue of trends, trends, we look at the main developments. Of course, there are countries that deviate from their trends. It depends on many factors. For example, the electoral cycle in a country that can be a trigger irrespective of the prices. And if I look even at some producers, when I talked about the oil price, some countries initiated reforms and revisited their legislation before the price started to decline. Mexico is an example. When you started the energy reforms of 2013, oil price was $100 a barrel because there were falling investment, national oil company, highly indebted. So I wouldn't generalize on every country, but of course there are countries that stand out, and this is where I investigate more the internal conditions. But the overall trend is that usually when prices go down, we see governments under pressure because they lost the main source of revenues and they are looking for something else. On the issue of national oil companies, I fully agree with everything you said. I will also add very simple criteria, I would say 1 or 2, but the first one is the clear division of roles between the various actors, particularly when it comes to the role of the SOE. Because in some countries we see that, for example, the SOE plays the role of the regulator and the commercial entity at the same time. I mean, how can you regulate yourself? You see, so this becomes a gray area, and it can cause not only inefficiencies but all sorts of problems. And of course, free it from political interference. Follow commercial targets, not simply to meet a certain government's agenda, especially if we're talking about staying in power for long, achieving some political gains. And in terms of its management and oversight, it's very important to have some independent voices on the board of these companies. I would say Statoil, perhaps, and Aramco are some examples where they have people from outside the company on their board. Finally, in terms of the voice of the public, I am fully supporting of people, civic society, parliament, having a more influence and voice, but it's very important that that voice is educated. Otherwise, it's going to lead to simply people opposing to everything and leading to a stalemate and delays in implementing reforms and changes. So this is where we go back to the importance of education and building capacity and building knowledge at all levels. But I would say the parliament and the civil society are particularly important in that sense. And the danger is that, again, I go to some countries, including mine, is when people get accustomed to wrongdoing, and this becomes the new normal. So you tell them, but hold on a second, can't you see this is wrong? Oh, it's okay, we're used to it. I think this is a dangerous situation, and this is something that we should be tackled.
Thank you. Yes. And I'm going to just sort of give people a heads up. I'm afraid we're sort of coming to time. I know many of you will have to leave, so I'll invite 1 or 2 more comments, and then we'll probably have to wrap up. And I'm afraid we won't get to any more questions from the audience. My apologies.
Just a short point on the state-owned enterprises. Completely support everything that my 2 colleagues have said. I think there's one additional point that wasn't mentioned, and that is around sustained investment. About 3 years ago, we presented the results of a kind of a macroeconomic look back over the fortunes of Zambia in terms of the contribution of the copper industry to both fiscally and in other ways to Zambia over the long run. And there you see a period of, significant growth in the contribution of the industry to the country through the 1950s up to the 70s, when you had a period of nationalization. and then a gradual decline in the fortunes of the enterprise to the point where it was then ultimately re-privatized in the 1990s. And the question I got asked at the time was, surely this kind of underscores the imperative of going for a private sector model of development in the mining and metal sector. It would have been very self-serving and easy to say, well, of course. And the answer is, well, no. And the answer I gave then was, no, it doesn't. Because state ownership doesn't imply bad ownership or stewardship. It just requires that all of the pieces that have been mentioned by my two colleagues and this other point of sustained investment is in place. If you're looking for a Rolls-Royce example of a well-run state-owned enterprise, look no further than Codelco, who happen to be an ICMM member, but that's coincidental. They're an incredibly well-run enterprise, and their contribution to Chile has been extraordinary for many decades.
Thank you. Elisa?
Yeah, maybe just a point on the question on Ghana, but I think which is applicable to other countries. So about half of the world's population live in country where civic space is either completely closed or repressed. So that means half of the world's population live in country where there is no freedom of expression, no freedom of peaceful assembly, no freedom of association. And that spans the entire range of least developed countries, low-income countries, middle-income, upper-middle-income countries. And what you see is that in some of those countries, yet some governments have chosen to be more transparent than others. So Azerbaijan is a case in point where you have relatively little civic space in the country, yet the government just on very technical points on the ITI standard is actually doing quite well on disclosure. Yet, openness doesn't necessarily translate into democratic dialogue and accountability. So that's where you see the difference where when citizens are able to exercise that freedom of expression and association and peaceful assembly, they're able to engage in a democratic dialogue with their government and push for further disclosure that makes sense to them. So it's, to whom are those governments that disclose accountable to? Are they accountable to international donors, international financial institutions, in the hope that that transparency, at least on paper, will give them more access to international lending, or are they accountable to their own citizens in country? But again, I think economic empowerment is not directly, associated with the political empowerment or the transparency movement that we're seeing.
Thank you. We're going to close, and I'm just going to take a quick sort of 30 seconds, if that, from each of the panel members as we go. A lot of what we've focused on have been, I think, some of the areas of concern, some of the areas that we need to lean into, some of the areas of challenge. But I wonder if we, as we wind up, can I have from each of you a bright spot, something you saw in the data, something you've seen in your work that gives you hope for optimism, or something you think is worthy of notice for the audience that people should consider as something worthy of replication, perhaps? Elisa, we'll go along.
Sure. So just over a couple of months ago, Canadian companies listed in Canada have started, so extractive companies, mining companies, oil companies, gas companies, have started disclosing their payments to government, thanks to a piece of legislation that was passed in Canada a couple of years ago called the Extractive Sector Transparency Measure Act, ESTMA, which is now leading all these listed companies in Canada to disclose their payments to governments around the world. And we know that especially mining companies in Canada are operating in hundreds of countries. So to me, that tells me, the transparency train has left the station. There might be hurdles on the way, but that's it. Those companies are disclosing. As I said earlier, 80% of the publicly listed extractive industry companies are now disclosing in one jurisdiction or another, whether it's under the London Stock Exchange or the Toronto Stock Exchange. And I think that's really a cause for joy and hope for the future.
Great. Thank you.
I think, despite the fact that, on contract disclosure, we've got a long way to go, we should also kind of celebrate the distance we've come. And those of you who are kind of familiar with resourcecontracts.org, if you're not, I invite you to look at the website. We have nothing to do with it. NRGI has quite a lot to do with it. In the space of however many years you've now been flying the flag for contract disclosure, we now have 1,500 contracts publicly available from over 80 countries. It's an incredible resource, and it represents incredible progress in an area that I think a lot of us thought would be very difficult and very taxing. So I think that is a bright spot.
Great, thank you.
Well, I think the whole report itself is a bright spot because, there's a lot of information there. But for me, there is one country that I was very happy to see, and this is leading the Arab world, that is Tunisia, because of what they went through and what they have been going through. I think this kind of ranking should give the Tunisians something to be proud of and to pursue the agenda they have started. I think that for me is the main positive take from this report among many others.
Thank you.
Well, in my case, I want to recall the high level of expectations among Ghanaians at the time the discovery was made. And therefore, in spite of those expectations, people have not realized the benefits. The promised benefits haven't come yet. So even though we are doing well in transparency, beneficiation is not matching with the high level scores we are recording in transparency. And that poses danger to Ghana because people are gradually losing interest in the oil and gas sector. And when they lose interest, it could lead to governance reversality. And therefore, the momentum is here for us to revive the interests of the people. And I see that the focus on practice is important, and not just legislation, not just policy, especially in the area of revenue management, how we properly invest the money in areas that will have higher impact, that will have multiplier effect, and that will ensure that beneficiation levels have increased in order to ensure that the transparency values are appreciated by the people. So that is the way I think Ghana needs to go, and there is hope for Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've taken a little bit of extra time, for which my apologies. I don't know whether...
a bright spot?
Not bright spot, actually it's a very dark spot. And it is the fact that most of the countries are either yellow or reddish, meaning they are weak, poor, or failing. And that's what the numbers say. But there is a human dimension to this. And that's what Mohammed was mentioning. When we see these greens and reddish, and even some of the greens, like my country, we are on the border between satisfactory and weak. The human dimension is that this part of our graph means missed opportunities of human and economic development. This is the consequence of being here. And what the Natural Resource Governance Institute is all about is about having a dialogue with governments, with civil society, on how to move to be green, and therefore to have opportunities for development. So I hope that the next time we get together, to present the next edition, if you invite me, Danny, I hope to see more greens and much less in this area, because then I will know that the human dimension, the human consequences of having resources is a good one.
Great. Danny, I'll hand over to you and just to thank our panel for...
But let me compliment all what was brilliantly said. If we go from what Ernesto Zedillo, President Zedillo just said, for a few pages later, to the next level down, and the more that we drill down from the 30,000 feet aggregate level, the closer we get to the human dimension, the more greens we find. These are the leaders and the people working day and night in some sovereign wealth funds, in some SOEs, much of that. And there's a lot of green taking place in countries that are not green right now, which show to the others what's the art of the possible. and Mohammed, Amin mentioned the differences between the gas and oil sector and the mining sector. So they're very important, that human dimension, to basically leverage it by looking very closely and using the data within a country and showing, look, even if we're not doing that great on average, look how much we can do in this area, why can't we do it elsewhere? The other great bright spot, most brilliant bright spot, was the panel, was President Zedillo being here, was all of you being here, the Twitter questions, as well as the brilliant work done by all my colleagues and the partners outside. And I just wanted to end with two reflections, which I think are important also for the way forward and to make it very clear. A lot came out as to the need, the importance of basically following the trends over time, for which, because we are so precise and we try to be so rigorous and careful, we're saying be very careful in comparing with the last index for various reasons. However, Aidan is absolutely right. There are some core questions which we are researching and will be encouraging that are the same that last time, and direction of travel can be suggested. Furthermore, and that goes to your point, Elisa, the enabling environment, particularly the governance dimensions, are totally comparable because those come from external indicators, the worldwide governance indicators. The worst performing country from 2000 to 2015 in terms of deterioration in voice and democratic accountability and civil liberties is Venezuela. Let's mince no words. There are others, the Colombias of this world, the Baltics and so on, that show exactly the opposite trend. And there one can trace right now closing civil space, in others what's happening in Russia and other countries versus opening. So the third component that we showed is totally comparable except for open data, which are new data sources, very exciting, which we drew also from the outside and we're using. But in terms of control of corruption, rule of law, and all those, that's comparable. And voice and accountability, control of corruption is so crucial because it explains, as Carole mentioned, and others, it explains also the performance in the first two components, the very sectoral ones. If that doesn't improve, it's much harder to improve in terms of the governance at the very specific sector, whether revenue management issues in the sector or the value extraction. Last, laws versus practice. So much the focus of the discussion is, of course, implementation is absolutely crucial. Overall, we find that that's a major area has to improve. That's not at the expense of still focusing, however, on getting the good laws, rules, and regulations adopted and approved. There's still major homework to be done that. It's not as if we have done there and now it's just a question of implementation, number one. Number two, how and what type of laws are adopted? Much simpler, not just borrowing from the complex old French or other European or US laws and just transferring. How those are done and the consultative manner by which it's done, where multi-stakeholder initiatives like EITI and others show the way of how to do it, improve the probability, the likelihood that they will be implemented. Part of the problem with implementation is because of how the laws were adopted in the first place and type of law. So I want to make sure that many lawyers probably here and listening, they still major homework ahead on the actual law adoption and rules and regulation. It's not just about implementation, because otherwise many of us, or many would feel that out of the job. That's absolutely not the way. Let's continue this, since we've run out of time of the formal part, but it's now a reception, so the conversation can continue. Again, this is the beginning of an exciting journey together. There will be much more analysis and research. There will be Google Hangouts, Twitter discussion and debates, a lot of questions that were asked, brilliant answers, but not all of them have been fully answered, so let's continue that. I want to thank everybody for being here, the brilliant panel, and our chair of the board, Ernesto Zedillo. Thank you.